Bé, bon dia, benvolguts i benvolgudes. Per començar, permeteu-me donar unes breus paraules en anglès al principal convidat d'avui i llavors procedirem a fer la seva presentació en català. Briefly, I just want to thank Professor David Dubois as well as the other invited speakers the invitation to come to Barcelona and to make this happen. Last night, a group of people went to dinner. We all were engaged in several conversations about mentoring, children and youth at risk, and how mentoring programs can contribute to their future, even after their long flight from Chicago, from Israel, from Denver. But beyond these conversations and others, we all could realize that all of you and he, for example, he's not just a raw scientist, but a very committed person who shares with passion what he does and his commitment for a fairer and a more human society. Thanks, David, for being here. David Dubois és professor del Departament de Ciències de la Salut Comunitària de la Universitat d'Illinois a Chicago i investigador de l'Institut en Recerca i Polítiques de Salut de la mateixa. Un dels lemes i dels valors marc d'aquesta institució de recerca és el de treballar estretament amb la comunitat amb l'objectiu de promoure la salut en un sentit ampli. I això es pot copsar molt bé no només en l'ethos de la institució, sinó també en la biografia del nostre convidat que ha treballat i treballa colze a colze amb organitzacions de base de l'àrea metropolitana de Chicago. A més, també ha estat mentor i així que pot n'exerceix. El professor Dubois ha estat partícip de les contribucions més rellevants en l'estudi científic que aquí anomenem Mentoria social, publicades en les revistes de més rànquing científic del camp. A més del centenar d'articles científics a què compta, també ha editat i escrit diversos llibres sobre mentoria. Un d'ells, de fet, és el manual de mentoria per a joves, que es diu The Handbook of Youth Mentoring, guardonat com el millor llibre de l'any per la Societat Científica sobre Adolescència i Política Social, Society for Research and Adolescent Social Policy. Un altre llibre més recent sobre l'educació extraescolar dels joves, After School Centers and Youth Development, també ha rebut la mateixa distinció. Les seves recerques més recents han girat al voltant d'observar quin és el desenvolupament i avaluació de programes de mentoria generals, però també alguns específics, com per exemple un que es porta a terme amb noies adolescents de minories ètniques. Fa poques setmanes el professor Dubois acaba de publicar un informe sobre el projecte Mentor, un projecte de mentoria impulsat per diverses universitats en un dels instituts de les zones més vulnerables de la ciutat de Chicago, el South Side. L'objectiu d'aquesta recerca és el d'avaluar el programa de mentoria que fa anys estan impulsant. Aquest tipus de recerca són molt necessàries, ja que la mentoria per si semblaria un fet senzill, el de fer ajuntar dues persones. Però de fet no és tan senzill com sembla i cal tenir en compte diferents factors, la identificació dels quals millora l'eficiència i l'eficàcia d'aquests programes, i el convidat d'avui ha estat un expert i ha identificat extensament aquests. Ara farà una setmana, a la celebració del Dia del Pare als Estats Units, el president Obama va convidar a sopar a la Casa Blanca a pares i alumnes de l'institut amb el que el programa Mentor col·labora, el Hyde Park Academy. El motiu d'escollir aquelles persones amb qui compartia el sopar era doble. Per una banda, Obama havia viscut i treballat com a mestre i treballador social molt a prop d'aquell institut. Per l'altra, Obama volia transmetre simbòlicament a la nació la importància per a molts nens i nenes d'entorns vulnerables el fet de tenir un referent adult, ja fos un pare o mare o bé un mentor o mentora. La conferència que s'impartirà tot seguit es titula Development and Evaluation of Mentoring Programs for Youth, Strategies for Fostering Success in the Next Generation. Professor Dubois, thanks again. You have the floor.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and I'm just very honored to be here today and the chance to speak to all of you as the first part of my participation today, but hopefully have dialogue throughout the rest of the day. So I'm just very honored to, especially this being the inaugural seminar of hopefully many more that you're having on this topic. So I'm very pleased. It's always the first one. Well, we'll get that. It's probably me. Okay. I'm used to this. Maybe me. Oh, nah. Not his fault. My fault. That inauspicious beginning, let's start again. What I wanted to do today is go over a few questions with you and hopefully, again, set the stage for further discussion today and be part of that dialogue. So first I want to talk to you about, just briefly, why youth mentoring as an intervention strategy. Why should we be thinking about youth mentoring? There's a lot of things we can think about as possibilities for helping young people for success and dealing with the kind of things that you all are addressing right now in your country. Then talk about why, if mentoring is an important intervention strategy, why should we be systematic and rigorous about developing and improving, innovating, to take the words of this morning's panel, mentoring intervention strategies and evaluating their effectiveness? So why should we, it's kind of intuitive for a young person to be mentored and nurtured by an older person. Why do we need to be so scientific or academic about it? So I want to address that briefly. And then, hopefully, having convinced you that there's reason to be rigorous and systematic about it, talk about what are some best practices for developing mentoring strategies, and also what are the best practices for evaluating their effectiveness. Again, echoing the remarks of the panel this morning. And just end with a few concluding thoughts. So, why youth mentoring as an intervention strategy? Well, it has a fundamental role in human development. This is not a new concept. Some people often, in writing about this, go back to the story of from Homer of the Odyssey and Odysseus and with the first instances of mentoring. But in actuality, when you really look back, it's at the very beginning of our species that the impulse and the inclination to care for others, not just those who are our immediate offspring, has its roots, it would seem. There's some recent research that we, in part, bested the Neanderthals in Europe because we lived longer. We weren't stronger, but we lived longer. And part of the thinking is we had more time and opportunity to pass on knowledge to the next generation. There's an adaptive advantage for altruism among groups living together when individuals put time and effort into caring for not just their own offspring, but those others in the group. And recent research has also highlighted that if you look at cultures that are not as industrialized and that may reflect more of where our human origins come from, that there's a couple concepts that are just pervasive in those cultures. One being alloparenting. Again, the idea that the care and upbringing of a young person is not the responsibility only of his or her parents, but of the larger group. And likewise, age mixing, where you don't segment off young people in different age groups, but in fact put them together so they're learning about nurturing if you're the older teen with younger youth in kind of cultivating and perhaps signaling those impulses to take action. So I'm not an evolutionary expert, but it's been interesting to read about that. These are folks who don't think about mentoring. They're just trying to understand what makes us people and gotten to the point where we are, and they seem to be coming up with mentoring as a recurring theme. And then more contemporary theorists have talked about just the fundamental importance for our development as persons throughout the lifespan, but particularly, of course, in the formative years, of the dyadic one-to-one relationships we have with those who can teach us, nurture us, help us get along the path of development. And talking about 4 attributes is perhaps particularly key there. Having an emotional bond, having reciprocity. We talked about that this morning too in the panel, or we heard about that. It goes both ways. You're getting something as a mentor as well as giving. Progressively more complex activities, so it's challenging, it's aspirational, and also a gradual shifting of power, so it's not all unidirectional in terms of what happens and what's talked about, that the mentee also is shaping that process and in effect learning eventually to be a mentor him or herself. And these are all kind of theoretical ideas. This is some data from one of my studies where we looked at a national sample of youth in the United States, a large sample that was representative, as they were young adults, and they were asked if they'd had a mentor during their development. And controlling for as many other factors as we could, we found that whether or not they answered yes to that question was predictive of a number of favorable outcomes that you see listed there on the screen. Being more likely to have completed high school, to have enrolled in college, to be working at least part-time, to be avoiding various kinds of risk behavior involvement, having better emotional well-being, self-esteem, life satisfaction, being more physically active, being safe in their sexual activity. So these are the kinds of findings. This is certainly not the first evidence that when these relationships occur naturally in a young person's life, they're prospering more. So then the question becomes, in part, can you formulaically create that, right? That's not such an easy thing. And we'll talk about that a lot today, obviously. But I also want to talk to you about, in addition to the importance of mentoring for young people's development, why should we be bothering to think about promoting it formulaically, supposing we can for the moment? Well, unfortunately, whether it's in the United States or I would venture to say here, it's not an assurity that a young person will have that access. I looked at some data in the United States that was asked of 8th graders, which would be about 14 years old. Similar findings were for 10th graders, 2 years older. The same survey's been asked for a number of years. You can see the years up there on the slide. And I looked at the percentage that said no to both whether they have a parent that they can go to with any problems or concerns, and also said no to any other adults in their life. So I dubbed these youth kind of having no go-to adults. From their perspective, there's nobody they could really talk to about concerns or issues or problems in their lives. And what we see on the slide there is that, if anything, that trend has unfortunately of about 10%, a little over 10%, 20 or so years ago, is up to something close to 15% now. Whether that's an actual increase, I don't know. That bears some further analysis. But the point being that it's not hard to identify large groups of young people who say they have absolutely no adult guidance, let alone that just having one adult who you can go to or a parent is not likely to be optimizing what we want to see in terms of mentorship. So that's one reason to be formulaic, is to get a more equitable and universal access to mentoring for those young people who don't have it. Another, a second prong to the reason for why try to be formulaic about it is that we have evidence, as I alluded to, that you can formulaically produce mentoring relationships that don't occur naturally. It's not with your teacher or your neighbor, but it's through the kinds of programs that we heard about this morning, we'll hear more about today. Those programs, although still relatively new in their existence as these things go, social interventions, have been around enough that there have been quite a few rigorous evaluation studies. And my colleagues and I, as well as some others in the field, have used a technique called meta-analysis to try to objectively synthesize all those results and say, okay, do we have an overall trend here, a pattern to reliably say youth are better off when they've been assigned to participate in a mentoring program versus always a comparison group of youth who were looked at who did not get assigned to have a mentor, or just for whatever reason they were in a neighboring school that didn't have a mentoring program, that sort of thing. And the evidence is very consistent of benefits in multiple areas: social, behavioral, academic, as well as emotional. So that's very encouraging. As was alluded to this morning, rigorous assessment doesn't always yield you the results that you're intuiting or hoping for. So it is not just a small piece of information that these benefits are there, and that when you look not just at one study but the overall trends. This is just a slide showing those results. I won't go into any depth on those. It's a little bit academic. But along with benefits in those different areas, mentoring also shows evidence in some of the work I've done of having effects that are comparable to those achieved by other forms of youth intervention. So, for example, tutoring as another strategy, right? Or programs that are intended to directly teach skills, perhaps in a group setting. Things done in schools to help young people. That mentoring looks comparable to other effective forms of intervention. So that's encouraging, that it's not only effective, but it looks like it can be similarly effective to some other things we know are helpful. Interestingly, well, let me go back to say one quick thing there. I'll see if I can express this clearly. What I think is unique about mentoring, relative to, say, tutoring or other kinds of, workplace training programs for young people, it has the potential, and we see this in our data, to benefit youth holistically. So when youth go through a mentoring program, they're showing benefits often in multiple areas. So they're not just growing in their academics, but also in their self-esteem, and also, for example, in staying away from risk behavior. We don't have a lot of forms of intervention for young people that are seemingly able to kind of push them along holistically in the various facets. It's not, so simple, of course. It doesn't always work that way. But it seems to have more capacity to work that way than a lot of other more specialized forms of intervention. Holistic, multifaceted. It also seems to have potential to be both promotive and preventive. So the question would arise for an academic like myself, listening to practitioners, is it that mentored youth get better and grow and other youth stay the same? Or is it that mentored youth they don't grow, but the other youth slide into more problems? Either way, mentored youth are being helped, either to promote where they might not have otherwise grown, or to not slide down where they might have otherwise slid down. Interestingly, we see both. The red line is reflective of what happens to youth in the various studies who don't receive mentoring. That they tend on positive outcomes like employment, grades, self-esteem to go down over the course of the study. The other youth tend to go up. So mentoring seems to be a bit of a win-win situation. Again, these are trends. These are lots of variability in the numbers, but overall, we see a trend that's encouraging. So, it seems that formulaic mentoring, if you will, planful mentoring, has some ability to capture some of the magic of what some of those natural relationships have long offered to young people. So why be systematic and rigorous about it? Isn't it kind of intuitive? Mentoring, right? Like, everybody in this room has probably done it yesterday, right? In one capacity or another. And so why do we need to be so, kind of academic about it? Well, one is that looking more broadly at the form of social innovation and intervention, when innovations and interventions are developed with theory and research, explicitly referenced, they tend to be more effective. So sometimes people mount interventions and they don't necessarily have a lot of background in theory and research. They can be successful. They tend not to be as successful as those that build on that knowledge base that was referred to and described so nicely this morning. So that's one reason to be systematic. It's also important to be systematic so that you have a record of what you've done. So I don't know how many times I've talked to folks out in the community who are doing ostensibly wonderful things with their programs, and it's all up here. There's no written record. There's no way to replicate it and scale it. It's like, oh, Amos, if you have an Amos, you can do it. It's like, well, there's only one Amos. Okay? So you have to have a systematic, formal documentation. And if you go through a process of being systematic about mentoring, you have that. The magnitude of the effects that have been found to date, as encouraging as they are, they're not large. They're not systematically indicating that most youth's lives are transformed and they're off on a trajectory of health and well-being. So we have a lot of room to go. Those effect sizes I passed over are what we would call modest in the academic world. It's also not safe to assume effectiveness of a strategy or program based on prior evaluations. So even though you might hear about a program that has been found to be effective in one setting with one population, in one country context even, there's no guarantee that that will be effective in your setting with the youth you're working with. So it always behooves you to be looking systematically, even when using a quote, proven or evidence-based program. How does it fit in with your needs and what you're trying to address? And we need to grow the knowledge base of the field and fill in many gaps. And part of being systematic about mentoring and studying its effects, we can do that. One of them is, as intuitive as it is, or plausible, that mentoring has long-term effects on young people's development, that when we do planful mentoring, that they look different as adults and into adulthood. We have almost no data for that. So the data I showed you for natural mentoring, correlational data, is suggestive of that. But in terms of planful mentoring, the kind of programs you'll hear about today and that you're a part of operating, we don't have systematic controlled research looking a decade later, 2 decades later, to say, does mentoring have a lasting effect? So we need more evidence, and that's part of being systematic. So what's best practice when it comes to developing mentoring strategies? So this is just a schematic, and there are some very systematic planning frameworks. I mentioned one up there called Pre-Seed, Proceed, but they all share in common the idea of these basic steps of assessing needs and capacities of communities and populations you're going to work with, so being strengths as well as needs-oriented. Looking at what seem to be the factors that are driving the outcomes for that group that you're concerned with, designing, implementing a program, evaluating it, and then going back again, as was alluded to today, and the earlier remarks, and saying, okay, where do we stand now? Let's go through the process again. So it's an ongoing cyclical process of assessment, innovation, implementation, evaluation, and back again. So to take that first step, what are some assessing the needs, assets, and priorities of the community to be served in the design strategies? You can partly go from existing data that will tell you about the needs of a group, other research studies, public databases, but it's essential that you also talk directly to the individuals who are a part of that group that you're seeking to benefit, as well as those who know them well. So key informant interviews, focus groups, surveys with young people, with those who are involved in their lives, those professionally or personally, those who've been involved in mentoring them in other programs if you're seeking to develop a new program. So you need to open your mind that you may not know exactly what the best strategies are and what the biggest need priorities are. Who has the least access to mentoring? Who stands to benefit the most from mentoring? What kinds of mentoring are most needed? What types of mentoring are already occurring? You don't want to duplicate efforts. You want to coordinate in a given community. What assets are there? What strengths that you can leverage in that community that you might not be aware of? Okay? Is there a large retirement population of individuals that maybe have gravitated to that area that you can draw upon? If you don't do your homework, you may not know those things. But after doing your basic homework about what needs and priorities are there, who should get mentoring, who can do the mentoring, what are the outcomes we want to most focus on, you have to get more specific about design. What specifically are you going to do with these young people around mentoring? And hopefully part of that can be reviewing the research literature and the scholarly literature that's out there. And that translation process, although still a work in progress, has occurred to the extent that there are some good resources out there without you having to become a professor yourself and going and trying to do that kind of research. A particular emphasis needs to be on strategies that have shown some evidence of being effective. High-quality experimental and quasi-experimental designs. I can talk some about that more, but I won't in the interest of time. But systematic reviews, like I mentioned, meta-analyses, what have they concluded? What are some of the best practices? And a particular resource that I wanted to highlight, well, a couple. One, my own, that Oscar so nicely referenced this morning, Handbook of Youth Mentoring, that is designed to be a compilation of the evidence from the leading experts in different areas. So if you're looking to train mentors, there's a chapter on training. How do I match the mentors and youth? What's the best knowledge base there? There's a chapter on that. There's about 35 chapters in all. This is the second edition. It doesn't really show up there, but so that is something. I'm donating all my meager royalties from that back into the mentoring field, so I don't feel so bad giving a commercial for it. The Elements of Effective Practice is another excellent resource. This was developed by the leading advocacy group for mentoring in the United States, and it is also informed by research, and it gets to be very specific about different practices. Recruiting mentors, screening mentors for background checks, setting up appropriate expectations, what kinds of training topics should be covered, What's a good strategy for supporting relationships once they're up and going? There are a lot of moving parts to mentoring programs, something that isn't as appreciated as would often be ideally the case. Many of you know that from the work you do, that when you're trying to get funds to support your staff who are instrumental to actually making sure background checks and training and ongoing support and those things happen. So accessing both the academic literature and some of these translational resources around best practices, I think, is just an absolutely essential part of developing a program. It's not a how-to situation. You still have to take that with the knowledge of your community, its needs, its assets, its priorities, and put the recipe together, right? And make something that really will be hopefully impactful in the ways that you want. But this is certainly some ways that I think will give you a better chance of being successful there. So what might you find when you look in that literature? Just a few examples, just to kind of whet your appetite, okay, if you're not very hungry for research. Youth-nominated mentoring. Interesting. So how many of you have heard of that concept? It's pretty new. Okay, a couple of you. Yeah. The National Guard, which is part of the armed forces in the United States, they have a social program that they've started where youth who are marginalized, often have dropped out of the education system, are kind of not clear where they're headed with their development in their lives, can get this opportunity to go to a kind of a residential experience where it's intensive training, and they get their high school diploma, and they get some life skills development, but then they're back to their community. And so they have a mentoring component. But instead of providing them with a mentor from community volunteers, they have the youth recruit a mentor from their social networks. And very interestingly, some recent research suggests that works pretty well. A quite rigorous study was done, and that it may be one of the drivers of how this program achieves the effects it does, which are pretty impressive with regard to education and also future employment. So these, at-risk youth were able, in large measure, and there's about 15-20% that were not able to locate and recruit a mentor, and the program provides them one through the normal processes. But interestingly enough, the youth recruited mentors, those relationships lasted longer and seemed to have more impact than the ones the program could provide. It's very intriguing, but that's the kind of research that you want to be tapping into and saying, could this work for us? How would that work? Let's find out more. One of the studies that I've been involved in was finding effects of mentoring on depression for young people, mental health, something we don't talk a lot about. And I reflected on that when we found those benefits. And in a large proportion, we're showing serious signs of depression, something like on the order of 20 to 25%. And I thought about, I'm clinically trained by background as a psychologist, doing therapy and so forth with young people. Well, what's the evidence-based treatment for depression? Well, part of it is getting the person to engage in things that they find fun and pleasurable. And you call it pleasant activity scheduling, so it has an official name. Okay? Well, what do mentors do? Hopefully, in many programs, they go out, and unlike a therapist, where you just have to assign that and hope they do it, the mentor can go along with that person and be a catalyst for having fun and getting engaged in things that are enjoyable. So in some ways it wasn't surprising, but it was also a new finding that has gotten our attention a little more to that. Unfortunately, in the understandable concern to address policy issues around things like employment and education, the kind of the unseen, often undiscussed epidemic of mental health doesn't get as much attention. Emphasizing the similarity of interests when matching mentors and youth is predictive of greater effectiveness. So maybe not something that's that surprising, but again, a finding to take note of. And another finding, support for mentors assuming teaching and advocacy roles. That may seem not too surprising for you either, but in the United States, there's been a lot of concern about, because a lot of the mentoring occurs with younger youth, say 10, 12 years old, of being too directive, too prescriptive, or crossing boundaries, getting too involved in their lives. You're there to be a friend, spend time, don't try to be a counselor. All those are wise and time-tested admonitions. But when programs have been very careful and methodical and intentional about building in teaching and advocacy roles, they're getting better results. Some of the meta-analytic work I've done. What would advocacy look like? I'll just give you one example of one program. The mentor with the parent writes a letter to the youth's teachers at school. They check report cards when they come in. They go to parent-teacher conferences. May sound like a lot, but when you put it down, it's really not that much time. It's a different role for the mentor. And so some success there. Will it work for your program and your interest? Perhaps not. When you do more of the practices that we found in some of our meta-analytic work, like training mentors, involving, I can get you the full list of these, training mentors, involving parents, providing structured activities like I just mentioned around teaching, something for the mentor to do and to kind of be guided in what they do with the young person. Setting clear expectations, which doesn't occur in all programs. Making use of community settings rather than limiting it to one location. There's about 7 of those practices we found that empirically were related. But interestingly enough, they weren't redundant. When you did more of them, you got better effects. So I don't know, yeah, it doesn't show up. So I'm so happy to use it. No, it doesn't. No, I've got, no, it's got a laser. I didn't do it in your eyes, Matcha. Told my children, never do that at an airplane. So in any event, the effects get better with those practices. And so, again, I'm trying to motivate you. Some of this homework and this work is to your benefit. Because there's nothing more depressing than, having to do the autopsy, if it were, of, after all the effort and time and investment into a program, feeling like there's things you could have maybe avoided. It's always impossible to avoid them all, but with some real preparation, I think you can do better than you otherwise would. But also going to the practice community. What are you doing? Even if they haven't been researched, listening to that community. Innovation is just rife out there, if that's the right word. It's in a very positive way. It's flourishing out there. And even if it hasn't been researched, you should be talking and dialoguing with those already working in the area. Asking, even if you come up with the best plan, is it something that a young person would respond to? Is it something that a mentor would feel they could do? One of the programs I'll talk about, we had wonderful resource materials, or so we thought, for the mentors. And one mentor just said it very clearly. He said, if it's not on one page, I'm not going to read it. And so, okay, well, so much for the 3 pages on how to promote, self-esteem. So we got it on one page. It's those kind of practical things. But if you don't talk to your stakeholders, you're going to find out too late that you are off target. Developing and piloting. So again, all the wonderful work in the world, before you try to launch the full program, take pieces of it and try to test them out. One workshop and see how does it go. And you can learn so much from that. You'll be glad you didn't do all 4 workshops because you learned so much that you want to build into those next 3. So you do this very careful piloting and collecting some data along the way of people's feedback and your own observations. So a quick example, let me also ask time, can you give me a sense of work from within that? Okay, good. I just wanted to get a little bit of a flavor for that. Thank you. So this is knowing I was going to be speaking with you and having some idea from Oscar and others, who the audience would be. That I anticipated that you would hopefully be interested in practical examples. So let me try to give a couple of those, okay, around this development process for a mentoring program. One is a program that I developed with colleagues in partnership in the community with Big Brothers Big Sisters in Chicago, where I'm located. It's for ethnic minority girls ages 10 to 13, again called Girl Power. And it is designed as an enhancement to a program that is already listed on just about every evidence-based program list you can have. So again, its effects though are not as consistent or large as anybody I think would want to say, well, stop here. So the idea was, you can build on success and say, can we add something in? So we added something more intentional. Rather than the mentors and youth going off into the community and kind of doing their own thing, checking in once a month with staff, the mentors and youth got together with staff in groups of, say, 10 or so pairs in a cafe in the community and had a Saturday morning session, whether it would be on future careers, success in school, self-esteem, avoiding, having healthy peer relationships, avoiding relational aggression, healthy body image, keeping physically healthy. We kind of the issues that are important for girls at this age, young people at this age in many cases as well, more generally, and we kind of gave them a start to discussing those in a supported environment. And then they would have an activity to do outside of those sessions. We call them power builders that they did on their own. Power sessions were the Saturday sessions. It was power everything. What we did when we developed this is we talked a lot to youth development professionals, mentors, parents, youth. We reviewed research. One of the things we found was there wasn't evidence-based mentoring program for girls, so we thought that was important to address. That others in the practice community had found bringing young girls and women together in groups was a very seemingly effective practice. So that's what we heard from people in the community and some research as well. And that fits with some of what we know about gender differences of women, not to overgeneralize, of really having a strong relational component, really enjoying spending time together in and of itself, not just with the mentee or mentor, but in a larger group setting. Also, girls getting voice. There was a literature about that, and that if you don't provide a space free of male influences, I did not attend the sessions except when invited. Right? It was a women-only, girls-only session, so they could really speak honestly and candidly and build up their voices. Okay? So these were all things we learned by going to the community, looking at the research literature, things that we might have had some awareness of, but we became more knowledgeable about. And just as a quick example, talking to the girls, they said they wanted to do things that were competitive. We thought, oh, that's interesting. We didn't necessarily think of my stereotype, girls wanting to be competitive. And it was interesting. They didn't care about winning or losing that much. But they just liked the fun of competing. If it was knowledge about how to eat healthy, girls versus their mentors, or what have you. So it was just a way to make things fun. But we wouldn't have, if I kept with my stereotypes, we might have not done that, right? Because I thought, well, that's not necessarily, that's more of a boy thing, right? So I'm making it sound like, I was naive or something, but I think we all are naive. We have blinders about certain things. We have to ask and listen. So I won't go into depth here. I mentioned some of these already about how we tried to go to the research literature. There's a picture of one of the sessions. I mentioned the competition already. But as we went through the process, I mentioned being iterative. As we started off, the workshops were close to a failure. Partly it was us training the facilitators to be more interactive and relational rather than just reading the curriculum that we developed to try to guide the group. But it was also the curriculum itself was problematic. It was overstuffed. It had activities for 3 hours, this and then that, and small group, and now go with your mentor alone. And what we heard from them, they wanted more time to just informally socialize. They're seeing the mentor-mentees are getting together on their own, but they wanted to get to know and continue to get to know and catch up with their fellow mentors, if you were a mentor, fellow youth, if you're a youth, and we had mentor-mentee pairs that would often get together and do things then outside of the group. We didn't anticipate that this would be this kind of social catalyst for mentor pairs getting connected. But when we heard that, we said, as much as we love all our activities, we've got to pair some of these out so they have time for that to happen. And we manualized that program. So if you were to ask me, I could send it to you and you could do it, all right, with adaptations that are appropriate to your community. So that's, in a nutshell, and this is a logic model I won't even begin to go into, but trying to, if you don't know about logic models, they don't need to be that detailed, but they're the theory of why your program will work, beginning with the resources you need and the activities you'll do with those resources, how you'll know that those activities happen, and what outcomes, immediate, intermediate, and long-term. And this is a good practical tool for developing a program, is to have a visual, like a one-page schematic of everything, how it will fit together. Another example that I'm currently in progress with is called Step It Up to Thrive. And this is a framework for youth in the teen years. It can go into older age ranges. We're working with 10 to 16-year-olds. It is a roadmap, is the metaphor, where mentors work with youth to initially, hopefully this is a hybrid car, identify their sparks. So what are their passions? What things really excite them? And they lose track of time. They enjoy doing it so much. And that is something that comes naturally for many folks, but it's a process of discovery for other young people, and having a spark champion, as is termed, an adult who can guide them through some exploration with that and connect them to others who might be able to, if they do show a spark in a particular area, further develop it. But also having the second step of the roadmap is helping young people to believe in their abilities. Not their current abilities. Oh, you're a natural at that. But also their ability to grow and still develop. We know that the human brain, for recent research, continues to develop even into the second, past age 20. So this is remarkable, right? That when you spend a lot of time on a particular activity, and they've done this with autopsies of cab drivers, brains and things, from donate their brains to science, and the memory portion of the brain is overdeveloped, right? Where you do spatial mapping, right? And so there's these examples that we know people play video games for a long time, and those parts of the brain develop more. So we know that the brain's always developing and growing. And if you teach young people about that, without doing anything else, that alone can be a beneficial impact. That your intelligence, who you are as a person, is not fixed. Well, I'm just somebody who gets angry a lot. I'm not good at math. No. Right now, you're not happy with how you're doing in math, and you don't like the way that you get angry in different situations. But with practice and effort and putting yourself to it, you can reshape your brain to be better at those activities. Here's an example of an experimental study with girls going into junior high school. And they did not do any math tutoring with them or anything. One group experimentally learned about the brain and how it's still developing and how intelligence is not a fixed product. And you can see, as they moved in, the first 2 time points are pre-intervention. And then, as they moved into junior high school, the girls in the experimental group kept their math grades where they had been moving into junior high, and the other group showed a significant decline. That's all they did. They didn't teach them how to solve the quadratic formula or anything, right? So these are mentor deliverable messages, right? You don't have to be an expert tutor. One mentoring program did this with the mentor and the youth developed a website together, teaching others about how the brain develops. Lots of fancy pictures with neurons glowing and things, and they just had fun over a year doing that. Those youth, subject to stereotypes, not only around gender but race and ethnicity, scored better on standardized achievement tests at the end of the year than a comparison group that did not have this experience. So just believing that, just as I know I'm short on time, but just to kind of, I want to make sure that some of these examples are unpacked a little bit. I won't ask you to raise your hands, but just think for yourself. Is there an area where you feel like your abilities are fixed? You just can't do that. There is for me. I'm terrible at mechanics. I can't cook. I could go on the list, okay? Self-grooming, I got a lot of things here, okay? Can a mentor work with me and get me to think, hey, that's not fit? Those are inconsequential in our society, right? More or less, okay? But if you don't think you're good at math, or you can't control your anger, right, those are huge, right? So getting people to believe, and a twist in this research, they're now looking at getting people to believe that other people can change. So if somebody mistreats you, if you believe they have the capacity to change, you respond more positively to them and don't aggress as much. So again, this is all coming out of fairly basic research and now getting translated to a mentor deliverable message and dialogue, which it still may sound fairly abstract, but one thing that's nice about this particular program is they make all their resources available up on the web, free to just go download them at the Step Up to Thrive Resource Center. Then they go through risk factors and barriers. They have a nice wheel that kind of explicate those. You can see that there, that the young person in the mentor dialogue about what are your strengths in different areas. 6 C's of positive development, competence, caring, connections. Everybody's got strengths. You help the young person see those. But what are your barriers? What are things that might get in your way? Let's have a discussion about those. Personally, going back to the theme of reciprocity, what I've tried to build in as we've done this is to have the mentor share for themselves too around all these topics. What's hard for you about having a growth mindset? That's the idea that your intelligence and personhood can grow. What are the strengths and limitations for you? Don't have it all just be you teaching the young person. And then finally, the last step there is setting goals and pursuing goals effectively. Oh, it seems like, goals. How many times do we have to hear about goals in the program, right? The science of goals has really developed quite a bit, actually out of the business world in part, because they want people to achieve their goals there, and they know that it's often not the case as well. Wonderful metaphors emerged out of that work, the elephant and the rider. And we show this to kids as part of the training for the kids and the mentors. That your emotions are your elephant, right? And you're the rider. And you say, I want to go, past McDonald's and go home and have a healthy meal. But the elephant's taking me in. And we have that, right? I want to go watch TV rather than study, whatever it might be. And so we talk to them about how can you structure your life and how can you think about setting yourself up for success after you set a goal. And it gets very detailed. With lots of specific strategies, and even then strategies about what to do when your strategies might not be working. So it's very detailed about pursuing goals because we know that setting goals is itself not something that is likely to be all that effective. I know I've probably just got a few minutes left here. this is just a and this PowerPoint, I assume, can be made available to people if you want to, look at some additional details on any of this. This is just a calendar for how the mentors go through that Step It Up to Thrive model. I won't be able to go into my slides on research, on evaluation. I know you're very disappointed, but you'll see those in here if you look. And what we're doing in this case, and we did in Girl Power, by flip of a coin, I'll just talk about this, the Thrive model. They get standard mentoring. Again, a program that we know has benefits. And then the other half of the group, the coin flips the other way. Their mentors get trained on the Step It Up to Thrive model. They work with staff who are trained in that model. They go to some group activities that help them with that. And we're seeing, does that help those young people to have better outcomes around academics, employment, attitudes towards their futures, and so forth, then standard mentoring. So notice that the comparison is not nothing. So the new generation of a lot of the work out there in the research field, and that you should pay particular attention to, in my opinion, is the fancy term in the medical world is comparative effectiveness research. And you see this, right? This drug does better than this drug, right? That's more the normal study now. It's not this drug versus nothing. And so in social programs, we need to know this program versus this program plus something, for example. And are we really adding? Are we improving? Are we innovating in a way? Because we have enough evidence from the things I've shared that mentoring makes a difference. We're trying to make the most consistent and most impactful difference possible. And you need to have a carefully calibrated evaluation to know if you've really improved. And we don't know yet on this. This is we have about 800 youth involved in the study, 10 different sites around the country. We're hopeful. We wouldn't be doing the work if we didn't think it was going to be impactful. But ultimately, the data will tell us if we're on the right track. Oh, just you have to. That, believe it or not, is me back when I had hair and lived in another city. That's my little guy. I learned a lot from him. He's gave me permission to use that. But let me just, I'm giving just little 30-second little snippets here. In the Girl Power program, we were collecting these feedback data, and we're like, just really trying to improve with the staff every time we do these sessions. And we're like, are we getting anywhere? Or are we just going around in circles? So we said, well, hold it. We've been asking them the same questions. And we've done this 2 years now. Let's compare. And so you can see the red maroon bars are the second year. Well, it was actually not even a full year. One was the spring and then the next fall. And the mentors and the youth were saying the sessions were more fun and they were more helpful. And the mentors were saying they were more helpful for youth. So, it didn't always look that clean. This is one of the nicer ones, but they never went down. And in many cases, we were showing improvement. So they don't know if you're working on your program, but at the end point, they were experiencing it differently. So if you collect those kind of data for yourself, they don't have to be highfalutin, randomized controlled studies. For the process evaluation, and I want to emphasize that because I didn't get a chance to go into those slides as much as I would have liked. The process evaluation is critical. It says, did your program happen as planned? And did people at least experience it as something that was worthwhile? This is not like medicine, where you might not like something, right? And it's good for you. We have no evidence of social programs that people hate are still good for them, right? So you have to have that. And you also want to make sure that things happen. With the Thrive study I mentioned, we're still in the process of getting these mentors and youth to these wonderful group activities to learn about thriving. And we're getting maybe not even half there. So what are we doing? We're mid-course adjusting because we're tracking that data in our process evaluation. We're in real time. We're working to have a version they can do on their own with the youth, and also an online version with the help of the foundation. so that working with mentors, rather than saying, how do we get them to come, because we tried our best, and some are going to come, but the others are not. So how do we actually work within the mentor? Who is a typical mentor? Wants to do things on their own schedule, not on your schedule. So those are some outcomes from Girl Power that did turn out to improve upon the Big Brothers Big Sisters in the small scale evaluation we did. So just going to the end here, but not too far over time, I'll be brief. Some concluding thoughts. The promise of mentoring is arguably, I would say, as well established as any form of youth intervention. So that's, I think, a point that is really important to not lose sight of. The glass is half full, if not more. It would appear, however, that only a surprisingly small portion of that potential has been fully realized. So taking stock of what's out there, what we see from natural mentoring relationships and so forth, it would seem, and the size of differences that we're getting in our formulaic or planned mentoring, it's like, when they say you're only using 10% of your brain or whatever that number is, right? It's like we're probably only using, X percent, whatever I won't put a number on it, that mentoring can offer. So we have this huge upside, I think. And I think there's evidence for that. And I hopefully, at least with my remarks today, have helped you to think further, perhaps. I know just putting these together was helpful for me. How more systematic and rigorous approaches to the development and evaluation of mentoring strategies can help to actualize that potential more. And in doing that, just being open to information and self-examination. That's kind of the core of everything. And important not to overlook the complementary focus on improving the extent and equity of youth access to effective forms of mentoring. Sadly, as researchers, we've really not risen to the call on that. So I can't point to you and say, oh, here's a wonderful new study about how to get mentors to volunteer, right? Or find the best, which mentors are going to be most effective. It's a very unresearched topic in large part. That youth-initiated mentoring study is one good example of, oh, here's a way we might be able to get more mentors in young people's lives in an efficient way. But it's a very under-researched topic. And unfortunately, we can have the best programs in the world, but if we don't have the ways to engage the young people who need to benefit from it and get mentors to step up, and the psychology of what it, in the circumstances that it takes, and the better knowledge of what it takes adults to volunteer. In Chicago, I present frequently, I'll stop here in a moment, on youth violence prevention, and people are wringing their hands. That's our crisis in Chicago, economic as well, but youth violence prevention, just young people in particular being shot, often killed on a seemingly daily basis, certainly a weekly basis. And government can do this, and the private companies are injecting money, and at the same time, how many people drive in to Chicago every day and out because they go to work, right? If each one of those persons were to donate 1 hour of their work week, right, to sitting down with a young person with the support of the kind of programs you'll hear about today, and with the support of their companies and so forth and so on, could you make a dent in youth violence that might not have been seen yet? I would venture to say yes. So it's great to develop better programs for when the mentor does sit down with the young person, but we also need to think about, and it's really right now largely relying on practitioners, because the research being as limited as it is, to really how do we get adults to be more involved. And the vision is one of much better health for future generations and global prosperity as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Dubois. Ara és moment del torn obert a paraules. perquè plantegeu dubtes, feu comentaris, feu preguntes al nostre convidat d'avui.
Now that I have the mic, so and before focusing on my question, I just like to state that we are glad and proud you to be here, but also Professor Amos and me. Thank you, because in Barcelona are flourishing and spreading several mentoring programs. So we are concerned, and in fact is our main aim, mentees, that we are in an ethical program. So we work with undergraduate and university students. So mentors are also our concern. And as you mentioned on your lecture, reciprocity and win-win relationships are key performance and success for the program. So my question is, in your purpose to enlighten and clarify with academics all this intuitive world, have you discovered any noteworthy finding that lead to a meaningful improvement for mental life? Have you any outcomes in there? Thank you.
No. So, if I understand the question correctly, and thank you, what do we know about benefits for mentors? We know some. It has not been researched as much as we would like, but we know a fair amount. Interestingly, the best research has been done with older teens serving as mentors to young students, as well as older adults getting involved in volunteering. So, for whatever reasons, those two groups, and you could probably guess some of the reasons, with young people, they're more civically inclined after having a mentoring experience to do more volunteering, which is, of course, something we would think is good. They, in some cases, show better academics. Interestingly, one recent study found better cardiovascular health for people volunteering. That actually with teens, there's now proteins, C protein and others, that are early signs of cardiovascular problems. And volunteering, getting involved in a social milieu in a positive way, even having health effects. So, and we go to older adults, finding benefits for physical health, cognitive functioning, have been going in to volunteer for schools relative to groups who haven't. What we know a lot less about is that middle sector of kind of, folks like my age and the kind of middle adulthood age or early adulthood, and you're in a company and you spend an hour a week, say, mentoring a young person. Are you a different employee as a result of that? Are you more satisfied with your job, feeling more loyal to your company because of giving you this opportunity to be socially responsible? Is your mental health better as you go into the workplace each day? We have, I don't want to call it anecdotal because it's better than anecdotal, but it's not rigorous in the sense of really being the kind that we have for youth outcomes. So the evidence we have so far is generally very positive. We need to know a lot more. One of my colleagues, and I'll stop with this, but one of my colleagues has college students, thinking of Amos and his program, mentor youth who are specifically referred by teachers because of having some issues around aggression. These are young children, 3rd, 4th grade, but they're already showing some signs of problem behavior in the school setting. And he engages in very supported, structured mentoring, the university students working with them. Those university students looked less healthy after a year of mentoring those young people, right? They seemed more, stressed, less confident about who they are and their ability to do things, right? So we need to understand more about this. It's not necessarily the case that it's always going to be a benefit, unfortunately, for mentors. And just like anything, we're going to have to really peel back the onion to see where where the major points of impact are. But in general, things look good, and I'd be happy to, and any of these questions, through whomever, I can try to locate, connect you up to other resources. I would also encourage all of you in this is something, it's a labor of love for me. I don't get any pay for it, okay? I have a listserv on youth mentoring, practice, and research. It has about 600 members from U.S. but around the world. And you could just post that question, and you get a better answer than what I just gave you, because there'll be people out there working in that area more specifically, and they'll want to share with you what they know. So any of you who are interested in that, just get me your email address and your name, or that of any colleagues, and I'll just sign you up. More email, but hopefully some email. I get good positive feedback on it. That's why I keep doing it.
Per aquí em sembla que hi havia alguna pregunta o alguna comentari, no?
Bé, jo no puc fer en anglès. Algú li pot traduir o com? S'ha de posar això. T'he sentit abans. Sí?
I think I understood. You said my self-grooming is very good? The joke from earlier.
Òscar.
I'm good. Yes, I can.
Bé, jo volia preguntar també els elements concrets de la formació, no? En el moment que nosaltres tenim els mentors, fer la formació inicial, si hi ha algun element, algun contingut, algun objectiu que a través dels estudis que s'han realitzat és clau per l'èxit de la mentoria.
Great question and very concise as well. So, rather than try to answer the details on that, and it will vary by your program, let me give you two good resources that will, again, I think be helpful. The elements of effective practice, which I mentioned from the Mentor organization, if you look at their standards for training, which they say all mentors should receive, not surprisingly, but they also go into the specific topics that are important from the research as best they can tell to address. Okay, and again, those are going to vary somewhat by program, but there's also ones about having realistic expectations, and that's how you heard from later today. I mean, just has wonderful insights from her, experience running a program about what to really, think about when selecting mentors, but I'm sure also preparing them in terms of things. So I think you'll see that that is a good resource. Another even more practical resource, there is a online training for mentors that my colleagues have developed and are researching that I can get you the link to. There is a small fee for that. It's like $5 US for each time a mentor goes through it. So because that's just the way it's structured. But it is a really nice tool because again it's online and it can supplement what you do, with your mentors, something for them to get trained on. But so those two resources I think would be helpful, and hope that's at least some value to where to go to look.
Bon dia. Jo volia preguntar sobre la durada. Sorry, sí, I prefer to get in català. Volia preguntar sobre la durada de les relacions entre mentor i mentorat perquè siguin efectives. O sigui, hi ha un temps mínim, un temps màxim la relació entre adult i jove o infant, perquè puguem parlar que realment la mentoria té una efectivitat, té un impacte que busquem nosaltres?
Another great question. This one is one that I've looked at quite a bit, as have others, and there are really no set answers to this at this point. What I can tell you with some pretty good confidence is that there are short programs that are very well planned that might last only a few months, 2-3 months, that have shown effectiveness, even looking later points in time, as well as evidence that when relationships persist in a program, like the one I mentioned with youth-initiated mentoring, when those youth-initiated mentoring relationships lasted 2 years rather than 1 year, they were active over that, and then even out to 3 years, you saw increasing benefits for the young person in education and employment. Those findings are out there as well to suggest that if you can keep relationships going, the benefits, at least over that time frame, continue to increment. Again, though, I would caution to say we also have evidence that short-term mentoring experiences can be beneficial. I think sometimes my colleagues have viewed mentoring too much in any one program in isolation from other experiences. So it doesn't need to be everything for the young person. It is one experience for them, hopefully among others that they'll experience. So what is really important, and this will be addressed in those practices that I keep referring to, and also in the handbook of youth mentoring that I mentioned, is how do you close that relationship? And how do you set expectations up from the beginning that this is a 6-month relationship or a 1 year or 3 months, whatever it might be. And some of my colleagues talk about they begin the goodbye process in the beginning of the program, because you're setting those expectations up. And so my guess is that those programs that have shown the positive impacts with shorter term, and I certainly just enjoyed hearing yesterday in a workshop we had on a program, which I won't be able to say the name of very clearly, Exit. Okay. That it's a short-term program, but I think it shows a lot of promise for being impactful because it's very deliberate and planned, and I think it's very upfront with young people about what they're experiencing. So while we hope and think that and we have reason to believe longer-term relationships are beneficial, the only evidence of harm that we have are when relationships are promised for a longer period of time than are delivered. So youth who were promised 1-year relationships or said that this is going to be at least the experience, and the mentors left for whatever reasons less than 6 months into it, those youth, compared to youth not getting mentoring, looked worse in their self-esteem and some of their proclivities towards risk behavior, perhaps kind of feeling like another adult has let them down. It's not clear. So I think it's, from what I can read, we need to do more research, but it's being very clear and transparent with everyone and thinking about the goals of your programs. If you're planning on and creating a familial, kin-like tie, 3 months is not a good plan, right? You need to say, this could be a lifelong relationship, and that's one model of effective mentoring. But another model could be a much shorter time frame of helping that young person in a particular area and getting going. And as long as you're planful and you're transparent, I think you're going to be on a path to making positive impact, rather than be too worried about, oh, this is too short if we don't go this long. And others in the panel today, you'll hear from, may have different views on that, and it's certainly something we need to have ongoing discussion about.
David, hello.
Yes.
Welcome to Barcelona, and thank you very much for sharing with us your knowledge and your experience. My question is very concrete. which is the difference for you between mentoring, counseling, and coaching?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to ask about that yesterday because in some of the materials I received, there was a distinction being made between coaching and mentoring, and I wasn't entirely clear from the materials, how those were being distinguished. It's not something that the academic literature has paid a lot of attention to, but I think, at least as I think about them, counseling often involves somebody with kind of applying with some professional background particular techniques to help people with problems or concerns they might have, just speaking generally. The coaching has really, in the United States, that term is not being used with youth, interestingly enough. It's being used in the business world and also out in the kind of self-help world, having life coaches, and also life coaches in the self-help world, and in the business world, executive coaches, which I guess, from what I hear, make good money. You can get, the executive, they're terribly talented, trader in your company or whatever it is, but, they're really self-destructive or a problem in the workplace, and how do you help that person manage others more effectively or what have you? So that's where coaching is being used to kind of cut into kind of the workplace and help people function more effectively and or help adults manage their lives. So I'm not sure. I'd have to hear more how you all are using the term coaching. I think ultimately those terms are not that helpful because of some of these translational issues. I think it's probably best just to be really clear as much behaviorally about these are the things that we're wanting this person to do, counselor, coach, mentor. These are the things we're not asking them or preparing them to do. Almost like when you're going to hire somebody for a job, the job title is important to a point, but more important is the specific duties that they'll have. So I've seen some programs treat the mentor as a job, and they'll write it up as a job description and go over that with the mentor. So that's something to think about, just to be really clear. But it goes to the issue of maybe some of the intentionality and how technical the mentor gets, some of these other issues. And I would say that, that's ongoing, how much we can expect volunteers to come in and be more, technically oriented and working with young people around problems or concerns.
Moltes gràcies, professor David Dubois, per la seva exposició. Queden 2 minuts per començar la següent fase, que és la presentació dels resultats preliminars de l'estudi d'impacte que s'han realitzat, que anirà a càrrec del professor Joves.